Again, that's what it means to accept limits. And how I reconcile those limits with my own absolute conviction and commitment, that's what the task of the dialogue is about. We have to help each other. It means even if I'm true and they're wrong, not to give up the right to impose on the other. It's all about limits. Now here's the point I want to make. It is widely believed in all our communities that these limits are Western, modern, liberal ideas, and somehow we're inauthentically undermining our own faith if we take them on. I'm trying to argue the opposite. In our own communities, it starts with the question of imitating God and being like God. That's the core, to follow in God's ways, to follow God's instructions. As the Kabbalah points out, God fills the world in every moment, in every place. There'd be no room for existence, no room for humans, no room for anything, were it not started with God's tzimtzum, self-limitation. Out of love, God self-limits and makes room to bring into being creation, so that God can love that creation and relate to it. Out of God's self-limitation, as it says in the Hebrew scriptures, Lo yirani adam v'chai, no human could see God directly and live and survive the infinity of God's energy, God's presence. Therefore, God must self-limit and make God available. That's, of course, implicit in Christian teaching of incarnation. It's the same issue. God dresses revelation in the language of people, in the language of cultures, and the language of tradition, making it available so humans can grasp it, although it doesn't do justice to the infinity of God's wisdom. And God enters into covenant. That's a Jewish teaching I believe all three of us share, into partnership with human beings in order to make this world possible. So what pluralism is about is imitating God and taking on that responsibility of establishing our own limits for the sake of life. There is a deeper truth in that. Life is growth, but unlimited growth is cancer, which will kill you. Industrialization, productivity, adds to the wealth, adds to life. Unlimited productivity, unlimited industrialization is pollution, destruction of the environment, and the end of existence. Somehow, if we cannot establish those limits, and that's what dialogue about, is to become more aware of our own limits, to become to appreciate the greatness in another tradition. Begin to realize, so my tradition, my understanding, my wisdom does not exhaust everything. Dialogue's about developing self-critique, to be willing to criticize the failures of my own tradition, to have the trust in the other, not going to use that as an excuse to dump or dismiss or to degrade my own religion, and thereby learn from the other's strength, from the other's insight, and hope thereby either to discover something overlooked in my own or something that can strengthen my own. The great 19th century revivalist Rabbi Yisrael Salanter in Orthodoxy said when he started this search for self-improvement, he said he justified himself and he criticized everybody else. As he became more and more self-aware, more and more struggled to do this, he said he began to criticize himself as well. He criticized everybody. At the end, he said he learned the great secret was to criticize myself and to justify and learn from the others. And by that process, of course, dialogue makes me a better Jew, a better Christian, a better Muslim. And I'd like to add, if I can, if it doesn't sound patronizing, I hope it doesn't. The Jews and Christians, I think, have been more ready for the dialogue because they're in the West. And again, I think that we have to avoid making the West the enemy. Not because the West is all good, and we're tempted to fight it off and say that's Western influence. It's because the West gave a ruthless, withering critique of our traditions. Jews and Christians, most of us lived in the West. It was the secular critique, the historical critique of our claims of authority from God by showing historical and critical approaches to scriptures. It was the scientific critique of the miracles that justified our religious claims. It was the moral critique of religious wars. So at the end, we were chastened, we were shown our limits, frankly. Again, it's gone too far in many cases. We have sometimes lost our own self-respect and we don't stand up. That's a challenge of balance. But I would argue that this has been, on balance, very healthy, very constructive. I would urge Muslims not to be tempted into saying, if I get the West off, it's the West erosion of values, it's the West critique to protect faith. The other example, again, I would argue, is the encounter with the Holocaust. Here again, shattering encounter, not just for Christians who felt responsibility for creating negative stereotypes of Jews in the first place that the Nazis exploited, but for Jews to realize the tremendous potential for hatred and degradation, the tremendous capacity for power of the modern world. Jews were in love with the modern world. That the modern world unleashed this kind of power that could be used for evil and for destruction. So the truth is, it took a great shaking up of these communities, a willingness to admit the extent to which our traditions had these tendencies to degrade or dismiss the other. Islam is tempted. It's tempted. It lives in a more sheltered environment. Most Muslims are in Muslim-majority communities. Modernity, for the most part, has not had the full impact. So it's tempting to push it off to protect the glory and the beauty and the power of Quran and of the tradition. But I think it will be a mistake. Muslims are tempted to deny the Holocaust, tempted to stand indifferent at anti-Semitism, feeling it's justified after considering the mistreatment they perceive being inflicted on Arabs, by Jews, by Israel, and so on. It's a temptation. I would argue strongly to resist it, because in the end, the greatness of Islam will be far greater when it has learned its limits, when it has purged itself, purified itself, strengthened itself, and meeting the incredible opportunity of a world that needs revelation, that needs God's presence, that needs strengthening. I appreciate your attention, and I have run a little over time, we're behind schedule, and I do want to hear the Crown Prince. So I'll just give one reference to the final point without going into it. And here again, I have learned it from Islam, and I honor it as I learned it in my own tradition. We have to think of ourselves not as a one-time revelation, but as an intergenerational, intercivilizational partnership. Not just with God, but a partnership between the generations. The task of perfecting the world will not be finished in one generation. The strength of our religion is that we have passed it on from generation to generation. But in the Jewish tradition, it became known as interpretation and the chain of tradition. Each generation has the authority to interpret anew, to strike the balance again. And we are lesser, but we also are alive today, and we are responsible. In Islam, it's ijtihad, it's the power of interpretation to restore the balance, not to be intimidated by the claim that one cannot in any way improve or perfect. I believe that challenge of saying this generation is not too small, not too inadequate, but that this generation can take responsibility with all its mistakes. The Talmud says that Jephthah, a low, immoral, almost freebooter judge, had the authority in his generation as Samuel, the great prophet of the Lord, had in his generation. Our smallness is not an excuse to pass the responsibility, to take responsibility. If we take that responsibility, then religion can be the forceful life that it seeks to be, then it can be fulfillment of the divine mandate. Choose life.